Hello, good people of YouTube. Mountbatten here, and today for your weekly top 5 video, we are going over my top 5 ships that simply are not worth it. Meaning that, well, these ships aren't really worth what Wargaming is asking for them nowadays. Some of them are ships that only return in certain events throughout the year, and while they may be good ships, overall, they just really aren't worth the ridiculous prices that usually are charged for them during these events, and some of them are just normal premium ships that I simply do not think are worth the resources and or money that you have to fork over in order to acquire them nowadays. So that is the topic of this list, so let's go ahead and get right on into it. Oh, before we do, we're getting very close to 60,000 subscribers. I am doing another subscriber giveaway once we cross that 60,000 subscriber milestone, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel and stay tuned for that giveaway. Alright, now into the list. So coming in at number 5, we have the Tier 9 Premium Japanese battleship, the Musashi. The Musashi and I have quite the relationship. It's a ship that I've been saying for quite some time now isn't really worth it. Why? So, typically when I talk about the Musashi, the first thing that is in the comment section is usually someone saying that I'm wrong, the Musashi is an amazing ship, yada yada, this, that, and the other. And sure, yeah, the Musashi is a good battleship, no doubt in my mind about that. The thing is, it hasn't really aged all that well. So, what is the Musashi? The Musashi is a Yamato, the Tier 10 Techline Japanese battleship, down-tiered to Tier 9. Basically, it's an alpha hull Yami. It's the early war version. You can notice that she doesn't have the mountain of AA guns and secondaries on her sides like the Yami does. She only has her 155mm turrets on either side of the ship. So, that's different. And the guns aren't nearly as accurate as the Yami. She has, I believe, 1.8 Sigma instead of the 2.1 Sigma that the Yami does have. So lower Sigma Yami, you still get the 18.1 inch guns, that is true. You still get the 32 millimeters of overmatch, and it is a Tier 9 premium ship. So you get that nice premium economy. So there's still a lot of potential here to get a ton of damage in the Musashi and get a nice tidy profit thanks to that Tier 9 premium economy. That is all very, very true. And back in the day, one of the appeals is, hey, you could be in Tier 9. Well, you are in Tier 9 matchmaking, so you could potentially find yourself in a Tier 7 game. So you could really bully some Tier 7 ships on top of, again, being in a Tier 9 ship that's basically a money printer. Well, fast forward to 2024. And Tier 9 matchmaking isn't exactly what it once was. Tier 9s used to be pretty comfortable because you're either in a top tier game against a bunch of Tier 7 ships that you could bully, or you're in a Tier 10 game, which is only one tier up, so not really that big of a deal. But nowadays, Tier 9s are getting sucked into super ship games, which is very much what's happening in the background. And super ships are, well, super ships. They're kind of rough to play against, and your standard Tier 9 battleship, or Tier 9 ship in general, let alone a, basically neutered Yami with less AA and less accurate guns, and there's no legendary mod for the Musashi because it's not the Tier 10, so you can't get the improved dispersion that you can get on the Yami, and there are super carriers now. And you're a Yami with no AA. A slow, giant battleship with Tier 5 AA. Guess who the Super CVs love to see on the enemy team? That's right, Musashis. Now, of course, every ship has their downsides, right? And this is obviously, a big balancing point for the Musashi, having a Tier 10 battleship, essentially with its HP, armor, and guns, at Tier 9. Very true. However, the only way you can really reliably get a Musashi nowadays is when she comes out in the auction, which Wargaming has wheeled her out several times for the auction. And I've seen screenshots of players throwing literal thousands of dollars at the Musashi trying to get her in these auctions. And of course, at the Christmas container event, the Snowflake event nowadays, at the end of the year. Not really worth it, fellas. Like, yeah, it's a good ship if you just get it in a super container, or if they ever return her to the store to just outright buy. Yeah, I'd say go for it then. But dumping several hundred, if not thousands of dollars at the game trying to get the Musashi, Just get the Yami, buy the premium package, and get the unique upgrade. You can pay your way through all of that for much cheaper than what I've seen most players spend trying to get the Musashi. I sat there and watched one guy drop $700 in one sitting getting the Musashi from the Santa containers. Alright, so when I say the Musashi isn't worth it, that's what I'm saying. Not worth what you usually have to pay up in order to get her nowadays. Again, if she does come back for a normal purchase, and for coal, for free XP, it's not going to be free XP because there's no more free XP ships, but for like coal, a normal $77 cash price, yeah, sure, she's worth that, but not worth throwing your wallet at the game, fellas. It simply is not worth it, in my humble opinion. Alright, that brings us on down now to our number 4 slot, which is the Tier 10 Soviet battleship, the Slava. Man, the Slava. This ship went through a pretty interesting development cycle. There was one point where this ship was just insanely overpowered with her guns and her armor, and I'm glad we didn't get that version of the Slava, the Pobeda. That would have been a pretty interesting little boat. But what the Slava is, for those of you that do not know, she's a research bureau ship, so you have to regrind lines several times, depending upon how you go about doing it, in order to acquire the Slava. And she has essentially the inverse dispersion gimmick that Soviet battleships have. Most Soviet battleships have the gimmick where, TLDR, the closer you get to the target, the better dispersion you have. The Slava, the further away you are from the target, the better dispersion you will have. So she's a sniper, right? And she has Soviet guns. She has Soviet 16-inch guns with, of course, all these Soviet goodies. Which means that at longer ranges, you are pinning most ships for, well, a good chunk of their HP. Because of the dispersion formula, most of your shells are hitting the target, and you're getting those wonderful Soviet AP shells on target. However, in order to have guns that are that accurate, she gives up a lot. First off, her armor, nowhere near as good as Kremlin. TLDR description, she has battlecruiser armor, right? Her extremities can be overmatched by most Tier 10 battleships. Hell, even most like Tier 8 or Tier 9 battleships can overmatch the Slava's bow and stern as well. She has far less HP than the Kremlin, and, well, she only has 16-inch guns, and only 9 of them. 9 16-inch guns at Tier 10 is not a heavy broadside for most Tier 10 battleships. Those that do have 9 16-inch guns at Tier 10, which is really just the Slava and the Wisconsin now, of course have some improved characteristics to try and help make up for that. I mean, you can look at some arguments about the Montana, saying that, yeah, the Montana has 12 16-inch guns, but they're 12 16-inch guns at Tier 10. Relatively small gun caliber by today's standards, where we have so many, 457 millimeter and above caliber guns at Tier 10 now, and the Slava only has 9 of them. So having 16-inch guns at Tier 10 means that, well, you don't really have a whole lot of overmatch compared to other battleships, and, well, they're still 16-inch guns. So, yeah, sure, they can pin, but anybody that knows how to angle slightly steeply to your guns are going to bounce your shells. So, while the Slava, yeah, sure, if someone is broadside and you catch them broadside, oh yeah, you're going to absolutely murder their broadside with your shells, but most players know, hey, just point your bow, point your stern toward the Slava, stay angled slightly in his direction, and there's not really a whole lot you can do. You can swap to your HE, at what point, it's like, well, if I'm just going to be HE spamming this entire time, why not just go play the Conqueror, right? So, there's that. So, yeah, and keep in mind in turn, like, you can get bullied by pretty much every battleship you can come across because of your thinner armor and lower HP and such. So, yeah. Well, sure, she has a pretty crazy high reputation for her time in testing. And yeah, again, if you catch somebody broadside, it's going to hurt. Unless you are like, one of the biggest sniping fanboys in the game, I wouldn't really recommend wasting the time it takes to get the Slava. Because keep in mind, if this was like a normal premium ship, like a coal ship, whatever, fine, who cares. But this is a research bureau ship. You have to regrind the line in the neighborhood of like, 5 times in order to save up enough research bureau points in order to acquire the Slava. So that's a lot of grinding that you're going to have to do for that ship, be it in free XP to convert to ship XP, and just free XP your way through a line, or cash you have to pay to convert ship XP to free XP. So yeah, it's a heavy investment, and it's not really worth it, in my opinion, unless, again, you are like a super sniping fanboy, and you get lucky and get a bunch of players that just constantly sell broadside to you the entire match, right? So that's my 2 cents on the Slava. Not really worth it. Get the Ohio instead. All right, going on our way down now to number 3. We have another Soviet ship, the Tier 10 Soviet light cruiser, the Smolensk. So the Smolensk is in, I guess I could say a similar boat to the Musashi, in that, yeah, the Smolensk by herself is a pretty solid light cruiser, but just like the Musashi, she's been removed from the game, and she only comes back in auctions so far, and in the occasional. I think there's one point she was in a Soviet container, I believe. If I'm wrong, feel free to correct me in the comments down below. And of course, Christmas containers as well. So, for example, Black Friday is coming up, and the Smolensk is going to be in the Black Friday auction. Well, the Smolensk B, which is the exact same ship. So, again, she's going to be in an auction. And, well, whatever they're charging for, probably going to be too much, right? Because I think the Smolensk, they had the Smolensk B and they had the Smolensk in the auction last Black Friday, and the numbers got pretty insane for the Smolensk in that auction. So, yeah, again, throwing your wallet at the game in order to get a ship that actually has been nerfed over time, indirectly, isn't really that great. So, what's happened to Smolensk? Well, the Smolensk back in the day was a real terror. So you could get her main battery guns, these rapid-firing Soviet guns, out to 16 kilometers. And the Smolensk, like most Soviet ships, have these Soviet shell ballistics, which means the shells travel through the air a lot faster than other nations' shells do, which means unlike something like the Worcester or the Atlanta, if you ever played either of those two American light cruisers, their shells get incredibly floaty outside of like 13 kilometers. Doesn't happen to Smolensk. So that means at 16 kilometers, you could sit in the Smolensk inside your smoke screen, because the ship gets a smoke generator, and just farm down those ships from 16 kilometers and not really care too much about what they would do, especially if they're a battleship, because they're already a slow, big moving target. So you could just sit there and farm them down, and wasn't really a whole lot they could do about it. And I remember that time, because I was one of those battleships that was constantly getting farmed down by the Smolensk. And then, well, they pulled her from the shop because she was too popular, which is wargaming for its OP. And then, well, a little while later, the commander rework went through, and we lost AFT and BFT for cruisers, which meant you couldn't push out your main battery gun range with commander skills anymore. And if you wanted to have a more usable main battery gun range with the Smolensk, you had to take the range mod instead of the reload mod. So now, in order to have a more usable range, which still isn't anywhere near what it used to be, you take the range mod, and yeah, you have a much more appropriate range for a light cruiser, in my humble opinion. Now, within that range, the ship is still a very good light cruiser. Like, yes, it still has the guns, they still have a pretty solid fire rate, even without the reload module, and yeah, you can farm stuff down, no problem. You still have the Soviet AP shells. When someone shows you broadside, load up those AP shells and absolutely murder them. You still have the Hydras, you still have the 8-kilometer torpedoes, you still have the thin armor that is, well, quite actually beneficial to your survival, because no armor is best armor in World of Warships, right? So all those big caliber AP shells just zip right under your armor. You still have all of that, but it's not exactly the Smolensk of yesteryear, where you could just sit and smoke at 16 kilometers and farm stuff down with impunity. So, because of that, yeah, once again, like the Musashi, not really worth throwing several $100s at your at Wargaming in order to try and get. the Smolensk, in my humble opinion. I mean, like, just get the Nevsky. Tech-line ship does a pretty similar thing to what old Smolensk used to do, except, at a bit lower of a fire rate. But if you want that long-range, HE spammy cruiser, go for the Nevsky instead. You save yourself a lot of money and a lot of frustration. But again, just like the Musashi, if they do add the Smolensk back to the game for a normal purchase price, sure, but definitely not worth what you have to fork over normally in the auction in order to acquire her. Alright, going on down to number 2, we have the Tier 10 American aircraft carrier, the FDR. Well, fellas, the FDR, man, this ship was for a very long time just hated by most of the community that weren't CV players, because, yeah, having a ship that has the ability to just launch an unholy amount of ordnance at you with its planes is a recipe for a fun and enjoying time in game. But again, like the Smolensk, times have changed, and the FDR, well, hasn't really aged that well. I think we're talking about her in the same context not too long ago, so I won't spend too much time talking about her here. But basically, you could launch a literal wall of skill at the enemy ship with the FDR's planes. The bombers hit incredibly hard with their HE shells, with their HE bombs, set tons of fire. The rocket planes aren't really that impressive, but man, can they throw a bunch of rockets at your ship. That's back when I think I was still running on a 1080 when the FDR first came out. And I remember when the FDR would do its attack, my frame would just tank in frame rates because of the amount of rockets that were on screen at one point. So that was good fun. But things have happened. We had the commander rework yet again. We had a bunch of global changes to CVs. They messed with bombs, the way that they fall, several times throughout the FDR's existence. And, of course, she got a couple of direct nerfs herself. Her planes are less tanky. She has less ordnance throwing at the screen right now, this, that, and the other. So why do I say she's not worth it? Well, because this is, a ship that costs you 33,000 steel. That's a lot of steel. I believe it is still the single most expensive steel ship in the game, for a ship that is nowhere near as good as she once was. Now, of course, a lot of these nerfs were very much needed with the FDR, and she's basically become a ship that you could, back in the day, with very rudimentary understanding of how CVs work, do quite well in an FDR. Even I had very excellent games on the FDR, and I'm a terrible CV player. But nowadays, you really need to know what you're doing with the FDR to get the most out of her. And if you know what you're doing, absolutely, she's still a terror to play against and an excellent CV. But, again, you gotta cough up 33,000 steel for her, which is a pretty high price tag for a not-so-newer CV, player-friendly CV, right? So, yeah, 33,000 steel. For less steel, you can get the Bourgogne, excellent Tier 10 battleship, the Austin, which is just a terrifically fun cruiser, right? And there's several other steel ships that you should definitely be getting before the FDR, before dumping 33,000 steel in the FDR, again, like the Stalingrad and stuff. So she's not really worth it unless you are an excellent CV player, and you can definitely make her do what she needs to do. So, yeah. Don't worry about picking her up. Not worth it, again, unless you are one of those dirty, filthy CV mains, right? And that brings us down to our number 1 slot. And that is the Tier 10 German submarine, the U-4501. So the 4501 is, she's a bit of a... She's more of a psychological weapon than an actual weapon in-game. The 4501 is a unique submarine in-game. She is ridiculously fast underwater. You see, most submarines are faster on the surface than they are beneath the surface. Like the Gato, for example, can go 32 knots on the surface. Once you submerge, I think she tops out around 20-ish knots. Most submarines have a pretty similar formula. Fast on the surface, below underneath. The U-4501 is the exact opposite. She chugs along at 20 knots on the surface. Then once you submerge, she can go a whopping 37, I think 38 knots if you have the correct commander build on her in the proper circumstances, which is ridiculously fast. That's what catches most people's attention. I mean, fair enough. Seeing a submarine just going under the water, outrunning some destroyers, is a little goofy and a little insane. And of course, that's what most players talk about when you talk about the 4501. she's a coal ship, so while, yeah, coal is free and not really hard to come by, you still, of course, have to be sure you're collecting your coal. And you might be thinking, oh my god, you have the 451, it goes 40 knots, almost 40 knots underwater. It's got to be this godly submarine, right? Well, speed is, again, what most players talk about when it comes to the 4501. What they don't talk about is her absolutely minuscule health pool. What they don't talk about is, yeah, in a straight line underwater, yeah, the thing goes almost 40 knots. But the second you think about touching A or D, guess what? You're going 20 knots again. She has this horrific speed bleed when it comes to turning. Like, she basically pulls a Cobra maneuver when she turns. And that's not really great because, well, if you have depth charges getting dropped on your head, yeah, dropping down to 20 knots and becoming a very easy target to hit is not great to your long-term survivability. And yeah, you can just keep your foot floored, and a lot of times that will do it for you, but guess what? Players have been catching on to the E4501 and realizing, hey, I need to lead this guy a little bit further, because if he does just floor it, then yeah, I need to compensate for that. And if you turn, guess what? You're going 20 knots again, and now you're easier to hit, so they don't really talk about that. And yes, she has a heal, but guess what? You gotta be at the surface to use it. And when you're at the surface, you can be shot. So there's that. And yeah, she has homing torpedoes, but guess what? They're not really that impactful. They're not like the Gatos torpedoes where, you know, they're basically gearing, well, they are gearing torpedoes, right? They're not that hard-hitting torpedoes. I mean, like, if you get like a whole rack of them on somebody, sure, they're gonna hurt. But most players nowadays can manage to dodge and only take 1 or 2 torpedoes from submarines, unless you just catch them in a bad situation, which, yeah, sure, at that point, yeah, they're going to eat the whole rack. But again, they're not any of these crazy nuclear torpedoes that, like, some other submarines have. So what the U-4501 is a submarine that's pretty difficult to use. But if, again, like the FDR, if you can make it work, yeah, she's a pretty powerful sub. But you got to be able to make her work. The other submarines are vastly easier to play than the 4501. They have bigger margins for error than the 4501. Because again, like the 4501, look at its HP. You're like 1 or 2 good depth charge hits, and you're dead. And yeah, again, she has a heal, but you got to be at the surface to use it. And typically submarines, they're not usually sitting behind the enemy ships. They're typically on the front lines because of their torpedo ranges and such. So you don't have the convenience just pop up in the middle of battle and pop your heal. You cannot use it when you're submerged. So yeah, it's a very difficult submarine to use. But once you get used to it, yeah, sure, it can make stuff happen. But again, when it comes to coal ships, there's other coal ships that are far better and far easier to get a hold on. The 4501 should be a coal ship you get when you're running out of coal ships, in my humble opinion. Again, unless you're like a submarine main, you watch Daz Boot all day in Red October, right? If you're one of those guys, sure, by all means go ahead. But for the average Joe, it's just not worth it, in my opinion. So guys, those are my top 5 ships that I do not believe are worth the resources, time, and or money. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. What would you add to this list? What would you remove from this list? Let me know your opinions on that matter. Hope you guys enjoyed. Have a wonderful Monday. Make sure to subscribe for the 60K giveaway. We're getting, again, very close to that goal, and that will be happening here pretty soon. By the way, we've been going here recently, which is awesome, and I cannot thank you guys enough for that. So again, hope you guys have a great Monday, great rest of your week. Hope to catch you guys in the next one.